Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma. 13 and a half. That's the average age at which Australian girls watch porn for the first time. In 2018, that figure was 2 years older, according to a new report on the impact of pornography on young people from the National Violence Prevention Organisation, Our Watch. To talk me through these findings, I'm speaking with Patty Kinnersly, the CEO of Our Watch. Patty, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Emma, thanks very much for having me on board.
We're talking today about a report from your organisation, the National Violence Prevention Organisation, Our Watch. Before we take a closer look at some of the learnings from this report, though, can you describe sort of more broadly the purpose of this report, why it exists, how you collate this data, who you speak to?
Yes, thanks. We have a part of our organisation that speaks directly to young people. It's called The Line, and it's about sex, dating, consent, healthy relationships and so forth. Because we know that young people need access to accurate information as they're developing relationships. So we want to make sure that the conversations we have with young people are accurate, that their voices are coming to light in the conversation, that we're not just making assumptions. And so that's a really important reason to do the survey. The other reason is that we know that the impact of the online environment, and particularly porn, of which 90% is sexualised violence against women, is having a real impact on both young men and young women, but particularly the relationship between young men's attitudes about women and entering into the real world into violence against women. And so this report just gives us another way to gather data to share with the community so that we can keep our eye on the ball, which is the online environment is big, it's having an influence on young people, it's crossing into the real world, and adults and people in leadership roles need to pay attention and take some action.
That 90% figure is quite staggering. So I suppose these findings suggest rather than there being some porn that is negatively influencing young people, the idea is that most porn is having a negative impact. Is that correct?
Yes. Look, some young people say that they find pornography positive. For example, LGBTIQA plus young people and people with disabilities. But overwhelmingly, the young people we surveyed, who actually we've also discovered that most young people are now accessing pornography by the age of 13 or around the age of 13, which is quite young. And most found it degrading and violent towards women, and that whilst many were accessing the online environment to understand and to have their queries answered about sex and relationships, most didn't feel like that was the best place to do that, particularly because a lot of pornography demonstrates women as submissive and men in controlling and dominating positions. So we know that the data tells us that men who hold attitudes towards women that are disrespectful are more likely to perpetrate violence against women in the real world. And so this data is really demonstrating to us that whilst young people are going online to learn about sex and dating and relationships because they're curious and they need to understand and they want to learn, it is having a negative impact on many young people, and it's something that needs our attention.
Sometimes the conversation around pornography can centre on teenage boys, but something that really stood out in this report to me is the average age at which girls are first viewing pornography, which has dropped by 2 years since 2018 to 13.6 on average. Can you tell me a little bit about young girls and their relationship with pornography, how that's changed over time?
Yes, we know that firstly, pornography has become increasingly accessible and widespread and normalised. And so young women are feeling pressure to watch porn from their friends or partners. And many do see porn unintentionally, it's important to note. Not everybody goes and seeks out porn. Sometimes it's fed to them on their feeds or what have you. The second thing is that young women, like young men, are curious and seeking out porn to answer some of their questions about sex and dating and relationships. One of the really challenging things here is that pornography has normalised choking or strangulation during sex, which is there is no safe way to do strangulation in sex, and nearly half of people between 18 and 35 have identified that they have been choked during sex in a sexual experience. which is really scary and kind of does move that notion, particularly I think that older people have, that pornography is just make believe and it's not a problem. But for young people, as you know, the online environment is not separate to the real world. And whilst people say, oh, they just need to hop offline, we know that that's not realistic. And so what people are learning and seeing online, particularly in pornography, which is so disrespectful and degrading of women, is crossing into their relationships.
So the younger you are when you first start consuming porn, the bigger the concern in terms of how that informs your attitudes to sex and relationships.
You're 100% correct. And a health report in New South Wales found that exposure to violent pornography was one of the four most common factors behind adolescent or harmful sexual behaviours in adolescence. So we know it is having a real impact on people.
You've touched on this a little bit already, but it's hard to separate this conversation from social media. A lot of headlines and talk and analysis at the minute about social media and young people's access to it. I want to learn a little bit more about that accidental interaction with pornography that you mentioned. How prevalent is that?
We're certainly understanding that very quickly when young people go online, they're being barraged with violent misogynistic content, and particularly young men are. And it's just becomes, when you think about young people spending up to 40% of their day online, if they're being barraged with content that is disrespectful and violent towards women, and that starts to normalise. We're now seeing that 1 in 3 18 and 19-year-olds have experienced violence in their intimate partner relationships over the last year. So it's not surprising, though, that if that's what people see as normalised, then that's playing out in their relationships.
What does Our Watch make of this plan to ban under 16-year-olds from social media? If we're talking about 13-year-olds watching porn, some of them coming across it on socials, if we take that out of the equation, does that solve the problem? I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
I think what's really important in any important change that we need to make at a community level is that it needs a whole range of strategies to all working together to work. So I think legislation about limiting access to on the online environment or violent pornography might well be part of the puzzle. It wouldn't work on its own. We know that young people will access pornography still. In the same way that prohibition of anything doesn't actually work, people will find their way around it. But it might be a positive part of the puzzle. What I would say is that young people are smart. They always have been smart. They always will be smart. And if we give them the tools themselves to be able to critique pornography, they will find their way through it. But it's not only the legislation, or it's not only talking to young people directly, it is also that we need to be talking about respectful relationships and respectful relationships education right through a young person's life. So there's a whole of school approach to respectful relationships education that we want every school to be rolling out in its entirety. But parents can also be modelling for young people what healthy relationships look like right from the very early ages. And it needs to be age appropriate, of course. So you might talk to your very little person about, if you don't want that person to hug you, you don't have to, and you should ask somebody before you give them a hug. So it's age appropriate all the way through to what does ongoing consent look like for you in a sexual relationship.
Young people, as you said, aren't going to stop watching porn. So what do you want them to know about what they're consuming? If there was one big attitude shift that you could wave a magic wand and see happen overnight, what should they know?
Look, knowing that young people spend nearly half of their day online and the real world and the online world are pretty connected, we need to talk to young people where they're at. And so we run a campaign called The Line, which is for young people, and it's on TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat and Facebook for the older young people, that talks about healthy relationships, what consent looks like, what is normalised, what is normal relationships, what is violent. And so I would just say to young people to not only look at the line and other resources, the eSafety Commission, for example, to be really checking what is realistic and what is fantasy. But also lifting their eyes and having a look at what do healthy relationships look like in the adults they know. When they go to sport, what healthy relationships are they seeing? What are they seeing in workplaces when they first go to work? What are they seeing in school? So they can put the online environment in context with the broader environment that they live in.
Just going back to the social media discussion, with so much of the outreach work that you guys do and other organisations and advocacy groups, if we take young people off social media, is there a danger that they won't be able to access some of those educational resources?
Yeah, certainly our work on the line is targeted at 14-year-old and above, and we do some of that work face-to-face and we do some of that through resources and some of it is online. So we'll figure out how to do that work if young people have limited access to being online. I do think, though, with any important legislation, we have to consider the unintended consequences and how we might cater to those. For example, rural and remote young people, the online environment might be their lifeline. We do hear from the young queer community that is one of the safe places for them to be. Same with young people with disabilities. And so I think any good legislation and policy process will try and work through, hang on a minute, we can't just cut everybody off because what about the people that really need this and it's important to them. So I think that process will be worked through.
Also, another big dialogue is happening around, the national domestic violence crisis. Do you think that there is enough attention being paid to young people and pornography when it comes to thinking about prevention measures, when it comes to understanding young men and violent behaviours?
Yeah, you're right to connect the two. This year already 65 women have been murdered allegedly at the hands of men. And we know that violence against women, all violence against women is underpinned by disrespect and rigid gender stereotypes and sexism. And obviously people are seeing that online. I think that the work going on across the country absolutely needs to take more attention of young men and how young men are learning and how they're feeling about the conversation. And I think that people have always known that, but the online environment has perhaps snuck up on everybody. And so we now need to be really figuring out how to talk to young men where they are, which is online. But they're not always only online. They also live in the real world, in their music, in their sport, in their faith, in their work, in their work that they do after school and in their school. So it is a matter of keep talking to people, keep listening to young people about what they need, and then building new programs where we need them.
Is there a world where we can teach young people about sex positivity and learning about themselves, their sexuality and their bodies, and that coexisting with the world of online pornography, or do we need to reset?
I think both things are true. There is absolutely a world where young people, I think the pendulum's a bit out of order at the moment. The online environment's taken us all over a little bit and it's having a big impact on people. But young people are smart. They will figure this out. We need to trust them. We need to give them more information. We need to listen to them more. Prohibition has not worked in anything, but we are able to reduce the harm of anything that is harmful with education, legislation, and trust and communications. Now, whether that's, cars still have the ability to drive fast, but we've learned how to put a whole range of supports around that. Young people have to do 120 hours before they get their P plates. There's better brakes, better cars, all of those sorts of things. So that's talking to people, training them, putting legislation in place. So we have to find a way for both to exist.
And last but not least, Patty, where can our listeners go to find some of these resources if they'd like to learn a bit more?
The line, which is just the line at ourwatch.org.au, there's all sorts of resources on there. And the eSafety Commission also has resources for both young people and parents as well.
Brilliant. We will pop some of those links in the show notes. Patty, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Emma. I really appreciate having a conversation with you.